Afua Hirsch, writer, broadcaster, and professor of journalism. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Every day goes by and it seems like there's a latest thing that people are talking about cancelling. The one today is the use of England's rugby song, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. It's going to be reviewed. Talk to me about that review process. Do you think it's right that we're having these conversations about whether things like statues to slave traders or songs inherited, that came from slaves, do you think it's right that we're having these sort of conversations?
I think that there are so many conversations we need to have that it's always right to have conversations. I think that it's easy, however, to get distracted because there is so little knowledge in this country about not Black history. And I think we need to really move away from the idea this is Black history. This is British history. And in many ways, it's white history. We live in a country that was built on the labour, the appropriation of land, the exploitation of culture and ideas from Black people specifically. And there are other cultures and histories of oppression as well. But this is really a moment to talk about the Black experience. And those stories have been systematically erased. So when there is a person on a plinth who maybe won a naval or military victory, but also profited from or encouraged the enslavement of Africans, we only remember the naval victory. When there is a song that draws on the spiritual culture of enslaved Africans in the Americas, we sing the song, but we completely ignore the history and the suffering behind it. And so what I'm interested in is how we can reinsert these erased histories and begin to center the Black people who are at the very core of this country. Because the thing that frustrates me is that now, even in this reckoning where we're starting to have these conversations, we're still centering them as conversations about white people. Is it fair on rugby fans to stop singing this song? Is it fair on a certain generation of English men if we don't glorify military heroes? And we're still erasing the stories of Africans, even in the way we talk about opening the conversation. So we do need to have a conversation, but it needs to be a much higher quality conversation. And we need to avoid falling into this trap where people think it's cancel culture and it's blame game. This is about our stories as British people. We have been so selective and dishonest in the way we've told them. And these conversations are designed to make that a more honest and beneficial conversation to everyone in this country so that we can actually be equipped to understand the society we live in.
What's your sort of feeling towards those people who are, the aggrieved, if you like, in this instance of who's losing their statues and all the rest of it? I mean, if you were to go by the people at the far right demonstrations at the weekend, I mean, it's quite a select demographic, isn't it?
I would actually say something that people might find surprising and say that I can actually relate to their sense of grievance, because I think that statues, songs, monuments, they do speak to our identity and our sense of self in our country. And one of the reasons that I want these stories told is that British people went around the world systematically removing those cultural moments and memories from other people. So, for example, my mother comes from Ghana. I have a Ashanti ancestry in Ghana. Britain, at the end of the 19th century, very deliberately destroyed the literature, the heritage, the monuments, the relics, the buildings that represented centuries of Ashanti civilization. And they did that so that they could break this culture and tell people that they were destined to be colonized by Britain. Now, I feel the pain of that destruction. I think many Ghanaians, many Africans, many people of Black heritage throughout the world feel the pain of that destruction of their civilizations. And it's Britain's role in that we never speak about. So I get it, why it's bad to destroy history and it's bad to take iconographic moments away from people. But the dishonesty has been suggesting that British people are somehow the victims of this. Britain has been the net perpetrator of this around the world. That's the story I want to talk about.
And do you think the discussion of these issues has, essentially distracted somewhat from that main cause and also more broadly racial injustice?
I think there's certainly a disingenuous element to this because look at the government's behaviour around the statue of Winston Churchill, for example. I didn't hear anyone particularly threatening that statue. I'm not aware of any intelligence that said that statue was going to be brought down. That statue of Winston Churchill in Whitehall has been attacked during almost every major protest in the last few decades. May Day protests, student fee marches. And yet this is the time that the government ceremoniously decides to board it up and make a huge point about how British pride is under threat. To me, that looks like trying to create a conflict where there isn't one. And I think that is very deliberately designed to send a message that the problem here is people asking for social justice, rather than engaging with the social justice that is actually at the centre of this movement. So it is distraction, and it's not motivated by people who are interested in actual progress. It's motivated by people who want to obstruct us from moving forward.
I think the Churchill statue has been boarded up on other occasions as well, but there is something interesting about its selection as an issue for the Prime Minister to talk about. For him writing that column as he did about it in the Telegraph. The headline generator was the latest in a long string of inquiries into racial injustice and that sort of thing. But actually, the majority of the column was talking about Churchill, wasn't it?
You really couldn't make it up, because the Prime Minister trying to make a big deal out of Churchill as if to play to his audience, secure in the knowledge that they'll feel under attack by the idea of Churchill being threatened, then talking about not photoshopping our history. There is no better example of how we photoshopped history than Winston Churchill. This is a Prime Minister who, yes, played such a foundational role in Britain being able to win the Second World War and should be remembered for that, but also should be remembered for complicity in the deaths of 3 million Indians in an avoidable famine, a racism that even his conservative, Eton-educated Tory cabinet colleagues felt was irrational and extreme by the standards of its time, and a racism that clouded his judgment, and who, after the Second World War, wanted to fight an election with the slogan "Keep Britain White." This is part of Winston Churchill's legacy, and for people like me, it's a legacy that is very much still part of the lived experience of being British, where these ideas that if you look like me, you're not really British, are part of everyday life. And so by photoshopping the role of people like Winston Churchill out of that history, we delegitimise that story and we delegitimise our lived experiences. So the Prime Minister perhaps is so ignorant that he didn't even realise that the real photoshopping was the job being done by him. And then we've had on top of that the spectre of these cabinet members showing that they don't, at the most basic level, understand the movement that's taking place at the moment. So Matt Hancock replying with a question about how many black people are in the cabinet by talking about diversity of thought. Dominic Raab believing that the gesture of taking a knee comes from Game of Thrones rather than from an iconic African American who's been penalised for standing up against racism. So they clearly don't understand what's going on, but that yet hasn't stopped them from trying to hijack this moment into something that feeds into a culture war they want to wage. While the British people, and I have been absolutely heartened and energized by how many people from different backgrounds, different classes, races, generations have joined in this moment of saying enough is enough. We don't want to live in a society where race determines your outcomes anymore.
That's what I wanted to ask you about was, well, you've answered the question about whether he is trying to stoke a culture war, but why do you think that is a sort of political benefit to him to be able to do that? Could you explain the sort of your rationalisation of it?
I think that this government, certainly this year, has really been losing moral legitimacy. I mean, I'm not someone who feels that they ever had it, but you know, the handling of COVID, and this was a moment where people who, I'm not a Conservative supporter, but I would have liked to be able to say, our government is managing this. This is a time to come together. We need to support frontline workers. We need to recognise that Black and ethnic minority people are particularly at risk from this disease. We want clear guidance. There was so much goodwill that this was a moment where leadership could help us going through this pandemic. And the opposite was true. The government has handled everything badly, has insisted on this idea that Britain has to be best at everything, even in the face of completely catastrophic mismanagement. And then with Black Lives Matter, this being a government that has no literacy on race, on racial justice, on blackness, on how to be anti-racism. I mean, literally hasn't engaged with it and seems to not understand what the message is even about. So I think that there has been a need to try and create a distraction and also win back support, and this real sense of having lost support, but the mistaken belief that you win back support by trying to characterise this as some kind of culture war where they can position themselves as the sensible voice of the British people. And, you know, they talk about woke culture and all of these things that really reveal how out of touch they are. People who are what I think they regard as woke, as in committed to progression, social justice, equality, never talk about being woke. You know, wokeness is not a thing. It's this thing that lives in their heads. And it's so ironic because people in the Conservative Party on the right often say that someone like me who talks about race and the need to be anti-racism, they say that I kind of want to be a victim and this is just a victim complex and it's just making excuses. And the great irony is that they have invented this culture war in which they can be the victims. It doesn't exist. And the victim complex is completely in their heads. So one reason I feel optimistic is that they're so tone deaf, so inequipped to be part of this moment, that I think they're really revealing their own weaknesses and their own ignorance. And, you know, people like me don't really need to critique them. They're kind of doing it for us.
But yeah, being woke is I think, largely just a meme. But on your point about this culture war and how it's a distraction, I would perhaps suggest that your interaction with Nick Ferrari the other day looked quite a bit like a culture war. I mean, maybe you could just talk about that a little bit. I mean, he said something which I think you found offensive.
That was actually quite an old clip. It was from 2018, and what happened...
Oh, was it? I thought it was recent.
It was old, and I did try to make that clear in my post. And what happened was, in 2018, I was making the point about statues that has kind of become a more mainstream conversation now about how we need to.
Yeah.
And if you watch it, it's almost painful for me to watch, actually, because back then I was so polite and I felt so aware that this was a new topic for people and that maybe they would find it difficult. So I kind of bent myself all out of shape to be very reasonable and conciliatory. And I was making the very modest request that we have a conversation about our statues. I wasn't calling for anything to be ripped down. I was saying, I think that we should be talking about the histories of these figures on plinths that we never talk about. People should know the full facts so that they can make an informed decision as to how they feel about them. I'm not telling you how to feel, but you can't know how you feel if you don't know the facts behind these people and what their legacy is. And we should have that conversation in an open way so that we can begin a sensible idea of who belongs in our public spaces. And Nick Ferrari's response to that debate back in 2018 was to say to me in a very friendly way, because we are on friendly terms, I really like you, Afua, but if you don't like it here, why don't you leave? And, you know, I think you can probably see in my reaction on camera in that moment that I was genuinely hurt because I'm British. I've always been British. And you just don't expect someone to respond to a very rational argument and conversation by saying you should leave your own country. And, you know, it's not the first time, of course. Like, any person of colour in Britain will tell you that they have had that said to them multiple times. And there is always this sense that if you look like me, no matter how many generations your family have been in Britain, your presence here is somehow conditional. You know, it's based on good behaviour. And if you don't say the things people want to hear, you should probably leave. I've never heard it said to a white British person when they offer a critique of their own country. So it was hurtful. But the reason that I reposted it was that when that happened in 2018, there was no reaction. Nobody seemed bothered by this. I was hurt. I felt that it fed into these racist tropes. I had a conversation with Nick about it offline, and nobody really took it seriously. And it was so astonishing to me to repost that now and see overnight 3 million people absolutely outraged that someone could say that. But this is the reality. And until a few weeks ago, it was happening all the time. It happened to me on TV all the time. By no means was Nick Ferrari the only person who said it. And I wasn't actually trying to single him out. What I was trying to do was, I guess, raise awareness that our broadcasters have felt that these are acceptable conversations to air, and that actually having someone dehumanize someone like me in that way has really been regarded as a form of entertainment. And that's the thing that I think we should be talking about, how those racist ideas have been normalized in TV, in entertainment, in everyday media and real life. And the people who suffer from that are Black people and people of colour. And we disproportionately have to live with the idea that we're being judged on whether our behaviour is consistent with having the right to be in our own country.
One of the aspects of that I also find quite fascinating is call it the take-up, if you like, because this is certainly not the first time we've seen Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and it's certainly not the first time we've seen an unarmed black man die at the hands of a police force in America. But I've been a campus journalist, so I've been quite aware. I've been aware of the Cecil Rhodes statue for a time, probably a lot longer than other people. And I'm sure, you know, as you just mentioned, you were talking about it 2 years ago, talking about these statues. But at the moment, there is this groundswell, isn't there? People are far more engaged and interested in this debate in a way that I think they haven't been before. Certainly, it seems like that to me. And I was wondering what your reasoning for that is, why you think there is this level of political engagement with conversations about race and class in the UK in a way that perhaps is unparalleled in recent years?
I think that it's important to say that the protest movements and activism of recent years has contributed to this moment. I don't think that there would have been an ability to coalesce around Black Lives Matter had it not been for the previous iterations of that struggle and the people who really mobilized that idea and took to the streets back in 2015 when Trayvon Martin died, when Sandra Bland died. In Britain, when people like Mezey Mohammed and Sean Rigg died in police custody, because we have a history of Black people being met with this completely disproportionate and lethal show of force here as well. But I think you're absolutely right. I feel that there are different conversations taking place for the first time in my lifetime, that the things that people like me have been talking about and met often a closed door. Now that door feels like it's pushing open. And on a really basic level, I mean, just to give you an example, whenever I've talked about the experience of Black people, I've often been met with this response about much more watered down ideas about BAME communities and diversity. It's actually been very difficult to talk about Blackness in Britain. People have been very awkward with the idea of a Black person owning their Blackness, celebrating their Blackness. It's been perceived as threatening, and that's an idea that really does have a history. And suddenly I feel like there is a willingness to recognize that Black people have had this specific experience, and that the emphasis on BAME inclusion often obscures the fact that Black people are still not included, still have worse outcomes, still experience a unique form of anti-Black racism. So that is really helpful because it means that the door is open, even if just a chink, to start having a better quality conversation. Why that's happening now, apart from the fact that we've had these cumulative effects of previous protests, I think COVID has played a really large role. This has been a time where a lot of our distractions have been stripped away. There are no sporting events, no music festivals, you can't go drinking in the pub after work. And I really do think that has played a role in focusing people's minds on these very real and tangible injustices that we've been so used to living with for generations that sometimes it just seems normalized. So I think that's played a role. And I think also the way COVID has panned out, people at the beginning wanted to think we would all be in this together. And we saw very quickly that our health service disproportionately relies on people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and that those people were dying more, even given their overrepresentation in the health service, in frontline jobs in transport and retail. And so that sense of Black people dying from this terrible pandemic, not being protected, of government failing to address that, let alone try to change it, and then the absence of normal life because of the lockdown, they've all kind of contributed to this vision, this clarity that people suddenly seem to have developed about racism and the need to be anti-racist. And as somebody who's been talking about this and writing about it, my book came out in 2018. It's now sold out. And I think people are now reaching for these books that were already there. And I think that, and not just me, so many writers have been doing the work. Reni Lodge, Akala, David Olushoga, Emma Debiri. There are so many books about the Black British experience. And we wrote those because we wanted people to educate themselves, because our education system is still not equipping people to understand the society we live in. And that is beginning to change in this moment. And I think all of those factors have contributed to it.
Afua Hirsch, thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Oli. It was great speaking to you.